Hello, and welcome back to Living a Culture of Life podcast by Human Life International. I'm your host, Colleen, and today I am very excited to share our second episode in the mini-series on ethical end-of-life care. If you missed last week's episode, Father Shenan Boquet and I talked about how the Catholic Church approaches end-of-life care, what the principles of ordinary versus extraordinary care mean, and what the Church teaches about nutrition and hydration at the end of life. On today's episode, Father Boquet and I tackle a topic that many people had questions about, which is the use of pain management drugs at the end of life. So today, Father explains what the Church teaches on this issue, and he goes over some different scenarios regarding if the patient is fully awake, if the drugs may induce a state of semi-consciousness or full unconsciousness. We also talk about the spiritual dimension and redemptive suffering and how much that should play a role in discerning whether or not to use these drugs towards the end of life. It's a great episode. I really hope that you find it informative. As always, if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please subscribe to the show. And if you're listening on YouTube, please like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that bell notification so that you can get notified when we release the next episode in this series. As I mentioned last week, we did just release an ebook on ethical end-of-life care. So if you'd like to download that, it's free, and I'll put a link in the description. Without further ado, please welcome Father Boquet to Living a Culture of Life. Welcome back to the podcast, Father.
Well, Colleen, great to be back with you again and to continue our discussion on caring for our brothers and sisters.
Yes, I'm really excited for this whole series that we're doing. And today I'd like to focus in more on medical related questions, which primarily had to do with pain management and then life support. So before we get into more specific questions, could you just briefly overview for our audience what ordinary versus extraordinary care is, which we talked about in last week's episode, and then also the principle of double effect. Those are kind of the two guiding principles that I see affecting most of this conversation.
Right. So what I would also just always like I try to do, lead people to resources.
Yes.
So first of all, the people who want more information, a little more in-depth understanding, is to come to our own website, and you can find an explanation of these various principles available. Also to use the Ethical and Religious Directives for Catholic Healthcare in the 7th edition. You want to look at paragraphs 55, 56, 57, 58, kind of guiding you through on these issues of care, particularly toward the sick, the vulnerable, and the dying. And also, obviously, the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops, website. So it's important for us to dive deeper in to make sure that there's a clarity and understanding, because as we said right before the podcast, I mean, our intention always is to provide, a clarity, but sometimes because of limited time, or we thought we explained something very clearly and maybe it wasn't as clear. So let's go back to what we spoke about in our last podcast on the topic. So when we consider ordinary, extraordinary, proportionate, disproportionate care. So if we look at this issue of ordinary care, so the best way to look at this is it's restorative, it's curative, it's looking at a way of bringing healing, to a situation. And that would not necessarily be burdensome. There is a great benefit to the patient, the person involved, and the means by which our methods, our technology, our approaches are reasonable, not burdensome, and not excessive. Now, that can mean physically, it can mean emotionally, it can mean even financially, different ways of approach of asking the questions. And then on the extraordinary, disproportionate side. Now, what we're dealing with in most cases is a situation where the comfort means that we've been providing, the restorative means, or maybe kind of maintaining the health of an individual, like, for example, in dialysis, right? Because we know dialysis doesn't heal, in other words, but it is, in a sense, of providing a means of maintenance and care that life can continue. And so, but things change. So as a person, like in that situation where maybe other physiological, biological things are changing, other situations in their life are changing. And as a result, the way that they perceive the benefit has now changed. So not their life is always a good, always of incomparable value. The dignity of the human person does not diminish in any way because of illness or even impending death, remains always the same and of utmost importance and value. Okay, but what happens is the person begins to evaluate Maybe the benefit is no longer beneficial. Maybe the burdensomeness that one person believed at one time was not as heavy now has become more burdensome. Again, not their life, but the medical treatment, the intervention. And so it's a way of assessing, that situation. So it's in a way, that's why that word disproportionate comes in, that the benefit is no longer proportionate, to the burdensomeness of what a person may be experiencing. So that's the way to look at, ordinary and extraordinary. And again, I prefer the terms, though they're interchangeable. We use them in interchangeable conversation. But what is proportionate? What is benefit? What is seen as less? It's not a heavy burden. It's something that a patient, or the patient surrogate can look at and say, this is of great benefit, and we will maintain. Whereas we look at disproportionate, oftentimes it's because circumstances have changed. Okay. So and let's kind of, if you don't mind, and I'll come back to the principle of double effect because it ties in here. So just kind of give the principles first of all. Yeah. So under the principle of double effect, what we're looking at is that there are two foreseeable outcomes, right? So there's a good effect and there is a foreseeable bad effect. All right. And so, but the principle has four very fundamental, in the sense of requirements, if you will, you want to say conditions. Yeah. And that is the act itself that is chosen must always be good. Right.
Or neutral.
Right. Or neutral. That's right. Yes. And so, and so the second thing is the only thing that can be intended is the good act. You can't do anything other than choose the good act. Right. Not the foreseeable. Right. But unintended bad effect. You cannot have that in the intent at all. Yeah. Right. The third, the good effect arises from, cannot arise from the bad effect. In other words, so then that's where we can talk a little bit more what that means.
And so the good effect has to come from the good/neutral action.
Correct. Yes. Okay. And otherwise, one would be doing evil to accomplish a good, which you can never do. Yeah. Right. And the other one is the unintended but foreseen bad effect cannot be disproportionate to the good being done. Here, I just use a primary example: a child that is in the womb that there's a diagnosis of a medical abnormality, and technology has come so far to be able to address that issue in the womb. It's remarkable, but it must always be proportionate to the good of the child. It cannot be disproportionate to the child's health. In other words, more harmful. So it's a danger. Now, I'm being very, very broad as what I just said, but that's an example where you begin to look at, that the unintended and foreseeable bad effect, in other words, the discomfort of the situation. You are placing the child in a foreseeable harm, but it's proportionate. It's not disproportionate to the well-being and protection of that child. And why? Because the life of the child is of equal value to the life of the mother. And to any other human being. So we don't look at the child as something that we can take a risk on, right? We don't approach that way at all, right? So that's just kind of an example. Yeah. So with that said, let's look at, I think some of the ways we can, and I'll just start in the sense of palliative pain management. Okay.
Yeah, that was going to be, we received so many questions from people asking if Catholics are allowed to use pain management and under what circumstances can you do it. So I do have a number of questions here that I'll probably ask you as we go along this conversation to kind of clarify and make sure that we're addressing people's concerns. But the other thing I just want to say before we jump into that, going back to the ordinary versus extraordinary care, just to kind of underline the fact that food and water are always ordinary care.
Correct.
That's just want to make sure that that's a clear thing because we didn't state it specifically in this episode.
Exactly. But we did go into great detail in the last episode. Absolutely.
But that was just something I kind of wanted to underscore since we were talking about it. So yes, regarding pain management, is it a sin to start using morphine or another drug to relieve pain?
So before we get into specific, let's go back to what we were talking about in our last episode in some detail. We spent a lot of time talking about palliative care, right? So, because when we usually get to pain management questions, typically it's dealing with a serious illness. It could be a short-term illness, could be a long-term illness. It oftentimes is related to a person in the stages of dying. So a lot of times in my parish ministry, when I was still in parish ministry, these were typically when the questions would come.
Yeah.
Right. And so let's look at how, again, palliative care. Remember, we talked about palliative care in the sense of how we approach. Now, it doesn't mean a person's dying, but it could be dealing with an illness, short, long term, or it could be a person of age. And it could be someone that's actually in the stages or foreseeable death is imminent. So in palliative care, what we're looking at are two kind of approaches. The overarching umbrella of palliative care is always in a sense of curative. There is still a process where the person's maybe situation might be dealing with an illness, might be dealing with something, like I said, short-term or long-term, but there's still curative dimensions to it. There's a way of also maintaining, right? There's comfort care still involved, and a person's life is still able to still functioning in the sense of some of the normalities of the day. Is still able to get out and be about with family, friends. May still even maybe working part-time. In other words, there could be different things happening in their journey that still but needs an overarching care. What I called last time interdisciplinary, approaches, and that is the doctor, maybe counselors, family members, the chaplain, their pastor, all working in harmony for the well-being of that person, all right, and addressing. And again, and that means that during that period, that the means that we're choosing is part of that comfort, that curative, that stability, maintaining their life and happiness and joy, and sometimes pain management is part of that. That's why I'm mentioning this, okay? Yeah. But then we move to another aspect of palliative care. People like to try sometimes to separate them, but hospice is part of palliative care. It's just that what's happened when a person now or a family member is approached with the idea that of maybe shifting from this curative comfort moment to the reality something's changed. And now there's nothing curative that can be done. Nothing that, in a sense, maybe the maintenance that was being able to be done through medications and maybe other means are no longer accessible or maybe no longer beneficial. So things have changed. So a person now is moving from that stage to where death could be imminent, meaning it could be foreseeable within a few weeks, a month, or it could be something maybe within the year or maybe within the 6 months. Usually it's a 6-month kind of approach, right? But what's happening is no longer is the approach curative. Now there's the acceptance, right, that my life is drawing itself to its close. And now all those same interdisciplinary approaches remain. Everyone is still involved, but the approaches change. The way of pain management, comfort care becomes very different in a sense of how it approaches. So, and these things are very important, which brings me back now to your question, all right? So when we're talking about pain management, so we're talking about a person that may be dealing with, a very serious injury, something that may be, again, short-term, or it could be a long-term illness that someone's dealing with. And as I mentioned, in most cases, and I think most of the questions that come to us are typically dealing with someone that's in a stages or moving toward a stage of death. That's usually when I would get these questions as well, as I mentioned. So here, the way it is, so we're talking about oftentimes the use of morphine or opiates. That's kind of what we're talking about. So morphine typically is given to help bring down anxiety. Also to maybe help someone in their breathing. But if given in higher dosages, it can have an effect of lessening the ability of breath. So we'll come to that in a few moments. So, but morphine has an intention and is usually given, and if it's managed properly, what we call dosage titration, right? So what we're dealing with is we're managing the amount of the dosage in relationship to the pain, the discomfort, and the situation that a person's in, right? So let's go back to the principle of double effect. So what are we striving for? To alleviate pain, to manage pain, to help a person to be able to maintain still life and functionality and not have a sense of being moving toward an intractable pain. That's a very different stage of life, okay? And it requires a different approach. But in the beginning, whether it be morphine or an opiate, it's being given to help manage that pain. And what's important for the caregiver and for the family is to ask those questions, right, as that process were to begin. All right. And so in that process, initially, you never give medication to purposely make someone unconscious. Right.
Okay.
So in the initial, that's why I'm saying dosage titration. In a sense, you're managing. So, the percentage that you're giving is trying to balance between their pain, their discomfort, right, their anxiety. All right. And you're trying to manage the amount. And then that amount will typically and does grow as the situation moves further down that line toward the end of life. It's usually what we're talking about here, right? And so that means the dosage may increase, which means the consequences of the dosages also increase. But again, principle double effect. What is the good we are trying to achieve? It's not the end of their life. We're not intending death. We're not hastening death. What we are addressing is pain. So think of pain itself as illness, almost in a sense. Think of it that way. So we're addressing an illness. We're addressing this pain. And the means by which we are addressing the pain, we're managing it. And we're providing certain medications, whether there be the use of a morphine, whether it be use of an opiate. We're using some type of a strong drug to address that pain. So when you or I have a migraine, what do we often do?
Take an Advil.
We take it, exactly. We take something and we follow the dosage. And then all of a sudden we realize it's not working and we meet the timeline, all right, the protective timeline. Okay, we say, well, and you can take up to. So maybe we might increase it because it really hasn't alleviated that pain, right? So it's the same thing. We're approaching it the same way, proportionately, right? So, but why is the church concerned? Right, for many levels. First of all, human dignity.
Yes.
Right. Second thing, we also want this soul, and again, here I'm making more reference, Colleen, to end of life, approach a moment. Right. So a person, we want them preparing for death. So that's why the church says we should never intentionally, and be motivated in a sense. Sometimes people think that compassion is just to make them comatose, to make them unconscious. So we get to a point where we want to feel like they're not hurting. But in reality, what we've done is we've deprived this individual of the opportunity of talking, visiting, reconciling, making amends, going to confession, receiving the sacraments. The church is concerned about not just the physical well-being, but when the physical well-being is moving to a stage of life, the church is always and has always been concerned about the spiritual life too. And I have been in those moments with people where it really is a moment of reconciliation, a moment of great grace. And they're so appreciative of being able to spend time with their family and those wakeable moments that no one can take away from them or the other people there. But as we move forward, now back to the principle of double effect, now the pain has grown. Maybe, as I use the word, it's become an intractable pain, a pain that just never goes away no matter what is given. And it's becoming now where it's causing this person, undue stress. Just this anxiety is building. They're agitated. And all these things are. So what happens is the medication dosages, again, begin to increase. The foreseeable is, we know, it might render the person unconscious. It might render the person into a unconscious state. It also may render the person's ability to breathe easily. But we have not chosen that. That's not the intention. It's not the act. And even though there's a foreseeable bad effect, right, the lessening our ability to breathe on one's own, things change. That is not the intention, but always addressing the pain.
So in this case, the application of providing some drug for painkillers is the morally good or morally neutral action. The good effect is the lessening of severe pain, and the unintended bad effect is that it might shorten the life of shorten a person's life towards the end, or
What I would
You
say,
seem hesitant.
I hesitate using that because, and the reason why I say it, I mean, I know what you mean, and I know what most people mean. The best thing to say is that it's not a question of the shortening. It just means that there's a foreseeable effect that will come at any given moment.
Okay.
And so, and so the idea that we know that. So the question is not days. We're not, because we're not intending days. You're not intending that. So
yeah. Well, that was what I was going to say, is that your
Right.
intention is to
right,
relieve the pain. I was using the shortening of days because that's the term that the Catechism uses discussing this. So,
right.
no,
it's fine. I'm just saying, but it's oftentimes the reason why I guess I'm more sensitive to it is that people sometimes, that becomes their focus of their dilemma,
Okay.
because it might shorten their days. When you just said the Catechism makes note of it, we know this. But again, if I help people to see is that that's not what you're choosing. You're not aiming to hasten, shorten, right?
Yeah.
What you're doing, that's the foreseeable outcome, that there could be the fact of, in the sense of a shortening of time. So I'm not fussing, but
that's
just
the unintended bad effect.
Correct.
So
correct.
you're not allowed to bestow painkillers for the intention of hastening somebody's death. That is not permissible. You are allowed to provide painkillers for a patient as long as your intention is to relieve their pain, and the potential, like the other part of that question is the unintended, potentially bad effect.
Right. So it's a way of looking at how we approach care. We're dealing with a human being. We're dealing with a human being in this stage that's moving toward the end of life, and we're doing nothing to hasten. And the means by which we are helping them to prepare for that moment is by managing their care, in this case, managing medications to help to lessen or to diminish their pain, or to the point when, this is what my other issue was going to be, we get to an intractable pain, right? So there, the dosage will definitely increase. But again, what are we addressing? The intractable pain, right? Even with the foreseeable, using the word shortening, or the fact of the idea is that we know that the more that this is given, the fact of it is that the breathing will become more difficult, and so forth and so on. We know that. So, but that's not what we're doing. We're not giving it for that reason. We're not trying to shorten, in a sense, their life. We are realizing that the medication given will have an effect of shortening or lessening, so forth.
And I would like just to direct our audience towards the ebook that we have on this topic, because we walk through the 3 different circumstances of, can you use painkillers at all? Can you use them if they induce semi-consciousness? And can you use them if they induce total unconsciousness? In the ebook? And it's pretty laid out. It's pretty brief, but we have quotes from the Catechism and all of that to back it up. So if you're listening to this still thinking, I want to read more about this, the ebook is a really good resource to really just be able to grasp what we're talking about. I did want to read from the Catechism on this topic. So in paragraph 2279, sorry, I can't read. The use of painkillers to alleviate the sufferings of the dying, even at the risk of shortening their days, can be morally in conformity with human dignity if death is not willed either as an end or as a means, but only foreseen and tolerated as inevitable. And then, so that was from the Catechism. And the other point we make in the ebook is that the shortening of life must be insignificant in such a case is a particularly important point. This is not a loophole that allows the administration of lethal overdoses of painkillers to those who could otherwise live for years.
Right. Which is number 4 of the principle of double effect.
Yes, the proportion. That's being proportional.
That's correct.
So, and so could you just briefly touch on whether the question about painkillers being used if they induce total loss of consciousness?
Right.
Because you were saying when you're first bestowing painkillers, you can't just put someone into an unconscious state, but it seemed like you were getting towards the point where as they get closer and closer to death, that might be appropriate.
And the word is might, because it also depends on the case. So if we're dealing with someone that really is dealing with intractable pain, I mean, so you're dealing with someone that no matter what you give, that the pain is so substantial that, the need before you is to provide more medication to try, again, you're trying to balance between, their comfort and in a sense, and also without directly causing them to move into that state. But at the same time, we know some people, as they move toward that latter stages of life, that, that this is the inevitability that's coming forward, in a sense of that medication is going to have to be increased. We know that our time with our loved one, verbally, consciously, is becoming less and less. They're sleeping more, and the medication is having a greater effect, even when there's not intractable pain. I mean, I've been in those situations where people's medications are gradually, having a deeper effect on them, and that also that life is drawing itself, and they're sleeping more, they're resting more, they're not as conscious as long anymore. And so the church wants us, and we want this because we're part of a family, to spend time with our loved ones and to have a chance to communicate with them, share stories and share memories. This is invaluable and irreplaceable, and so that's what we want to, that's what we're seeking, that great good.
Yeah.
All right. And so even though, like I said, even though we know that there may come a point, all right, case by case, where maybe the dosage, right, that is given may have to increase, depending on the situation. So for people who've been asking this question, what I would say is, first of all, whether you're at home, whether you're in the hospital or a skilled facility, remember that the patient is still the decision maker, right? Secondly, when the patient is no longer capable of making that decision and a proxy is making that decision, that we must ask questions. We are the ones responsible for ourselves and or for our loved ones, and we need to dialogue with the doctors, with the caregivers, and understand what is happening, so that our decision making is based upon understanding and upon experience and the expertise of those in that field. And we also know that, sadly, not everybody, Colleen, shares our values.
Yeah.
So what's important here is, long before these moments arrive, we should be asking these kinds of questions of those that are going to be caring for our loved ones. Do you share these values? This is the approach I want. This is how we're going to approach this, with the doctor or the nurse or whatever the palliative care may be, or in a hospice may be. This is our approach.
Yeah.
And if they can't facilitate that, then it's time for us to find someone else who will.
And in a future episode, we'll talk about some of those questions you can ask when trying to find a hospice provider. One question I do have for you is, do you have any recommendations for audience members about how to basically advocate on behalf of the patient when you have a hospice provider who appears to, from the outside, be giving more painkillers than would be proportionate, especially if you as the caregiver are not very medically inclined? You don't, is there any particular questions you can ask in that case? Is there anything you can kind of say to discern whether or not this nurse has the patient's best intentions at heart?
So I always try, again, as I just said, is when I was still in parish ministry, visiting the sick in the homebound hospitals, you want to dialogue with people long before, right? Now, in many cases, sometimes you're not given that opportunity, right? So, but in most cases, you are. And so this is the moment to have that kind of conversation with someone, because what I've experienced is there are very noble palliative care providers that oftentimes are given a bad reputation, partly because the family or friends may not understand, right? But that's part of the fact of a lack of dialogue, a lack of communication. And what may be perceived as being aggressive may not necessarily be so.
Okay.
Then we have situations where that is so. But that's why what I always did is, because by visiting with the families, talking with them, whether they be in short-term, long-term care, or whether in the fact of moving toward the latter part of life, is to talk this out. And so when you're interviewing a palliative care provider, is to ask those kinds of questions. This is what our values are. Do you recognize these values, and do you support these values?
Will you respect them?
And make it very clear. I am the decider, the patient. But let's say that you're my sister. But when I'm no longer able, I'm telling you now, making it clear, it's already taken care of. Colleen is my proxy. When I cannot speak for myself, my sister will speak for me, right? But my proxy shares my values.
Yeah.
So this becomes a means of preventing those moments at the end. The other part is, again, communication, healthy conversation.
Yeah.
Many times when we're in the middle of difficulties, we don't always hear what the doctor explained or what the nurse explained. And again, there are very bad situations.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not downplaying that at all, which I think many of our listeners probably are kind of thinking about when they ask these questions.
Yeah.
And I've been in those moments, right? And I've had to confront those moments. So I've been there. But a lot of times it was just that lack of communication, because what the family might perceive, why are we increasing the dosage when the dosage was not asked for? Or maybe there was no communication that there would be an increase. And what is it based on? You want to have those kinds of conversations to prevent those moments of unnecessary tension.
Yeah.
Because you want everybody to have the good of the patient in mind. That's the goal.
Yeah.
That's the goal. So that's always my recommendation. Now, when you're thrust into a moment that maybe you didn't have control of, right? Or maybe you didn't know more about. Maybe it's the only palliative care provider in the community. You might not know enough about them, right? But now you're in the midst of them. Okay, now you have to really make decisions. And sometimes, you may have to dismiss someone's care, right? Right? You may have to say, no, we're not doing this. And sometimes, you may have to make a very strong stand. But again, you have to know and have a conversation. Make sure things are clear, clarity, right? And what are the do's and what are the do nots, right? And so, and also sometimes, I'll just say this lastly, sometimes it's the fault of the caregiver on the healthcare side, and sometimes it's the fault of the caregiver on the family side, where there is a misunderstanding, a miscommunication, a perception.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to be, and I just went through this, and I'm not going to give the example outright, but in one of the countries I was in of recent, where I was helping a family in those decision making, and when the caregiver on the healthcare side came in and was a little more aggressive because of the situation they were looking at, and it was a difficult, painful, very difficult, agitated situation, wanted to increase a certain medication, and the family responded very differently. And the family was correct, right? But the idea is, but when you sat down with the caregiver on the healthcare side, they said, "Oh, that was never my intention." And you can see this sincerity. The family said, "You can see it. It's just they're looking at this difficulty, and they want to try to help." And sometimes they may think, but it's a sense of a false compassion too gets in there, a quality of life definition, an efficiency definition.
Yeah.
These are the dangers, Colleen, which we've talked about. Sorry.
Yeah, and that was just something that I was really just kind of reflecting on as I read through people's emails, and just I heard there was one woman who expressed a really great experience that they had with hospice, a number of people who had stories that was just like kind of traumatic for them having to deal with, and a lot of just kind of distrust of hospice in general that was expressed. And one thing I was thinking about was just how tragic it is and how much the culture of death has permeated our medical sphere, so that you don't always know if you're going to have a healthcare provider who shares your values or one who's going to have just the more efficient quality of life mindset. And I don't know, I was just kind of reflecting on just like what a tragedy it is for society, for culture, for individuals, that at this end of life, which is such an emotionally like trying time, not to be able to feel like you can trust the medical provider.
Right. If I may, and I know we're going a little longer, but if I may, we're also, myself are speaking from a U.S. base.
Yes.
Okay. Let's step into the mission field.
Okay.
And I'm going to step back in time, right? When my grandparents, godparents, godmother particularly, who died at home, right? Well, these means of palliative care from a healthcare side were not available, right? So what was available was the care of a family. So, and the care of being at home. And what did the family provide? Comfort care. They provided what they could provide, what they could help with, whatever medications they could provide. All right.
Yeah.
They didn't have access to the pharmacies. Maybe they didn't have access to the opioids and morphine, but what they had was what they could give. and what they were familiar with, and they could give themselves, their hand, their holding, comforting, assurance, and just doing everything they could, to help that person, manage their pain, all right? Knowing that there was probably something that you couldn't do. I have seen this in the mission field, right? Where they don't have access to the very things we're talking about.
Yeah.
But what universally people have access to is love, is care, is tenderness, compassion, respect for human life, right? Serving human life, even when there is nothing medically you can do, or you don't have any medical means of providing. But what you can give is yourself.
Yeah.
And being present. This is palliative care. This is what hospice care is, right? Yeah. And we should never, in a sense of delegate outside of ourselves what we ourselves should be doing. What we're talking about is people, healthcare and science and medicine assisting us, right, in that journey, even when there's nothing that science and medicine can do to change, right? Can't heal, right?
Yeah.
Right. So I say this because oftentimes we're speaking, all of us, and probably most of our questions are coming from people within our boundaries of the United States. But when you start talking about dialysis, ventilators, specialized medical care, specialized equipment, that's just not accessible. Yeah. It's not a resource that they have. And so as a result, decisions are made not because they don't love life, not because they don't love their loved one. It's just the means that sometimes would be available in other countries are not available to them.
Yeah.
But it doesn't lessen their love and care, right? So it's important for us to see that,
No,
especially us. We see it because we're in this an international family, and so that's very, very important. And so I believe that it's important to see that we all are called to serve life.
Now, I just want to go with a few more specific questions about pain management. So one question that we received is, what if the patient is unconscious and able to communicate? And then kind of to further that, what if you don't necessarily know what level of pain they're at? Is there a way to determine when it's appropriate to bestow painkillers and when it's not? How do you keep it proportional if the patient isn't able to communicate?
Well, again, it's science. I mean, you're obviously, because you're working in that interdisciplinary approach. Healthcare providers are still part of this conversation, right? So people coming into your home or maybe in a care facility, right, where they are helping you to manage, and their expertise, their experience, you can often see agitation, right? If a person's agitated, we can read their blood pressure. There are many ways of which they're breathing. So you're always observing. You're paying attention. But typically, what I've seen in patients, in people moving toward those latter stages of life, I've been in moments where it's been very difficult. It was a difficult journey to that end.
Yeah.
And no matter what means were provided, and I've seen just such peaceful. And I've been in situations where I'm still talking to this person 5 minutes before they're dead, and they're having a conversation with me. All right. And thanking me for coming to their home and praying with them. And then just within minutes, gone. So it's really that case by case, but it really is, and people who, that's why there's a personal connection here. Yeah. Right? Because you're bathing them, you're cleaning them. When someone is not feeling well, and parents are good judges with their kids.
And it is appropriate, if somebody is unconscious, to provide painkillers if they seem to be in pain.
Yes, you can. Okay. So, but again, it's again perception and using the technologies, the science, the medicine that is there to evaluate, to assess. Yeah. But I mean, if a person's calm and there's no foreseeable, in a sense of they're agitated, uncomfortable, any signs of grimace, pain. Why would I give them anything more?
Yeah.
No, there's not a need for it.
That makes sense.
As things change, yes.
And then the other thing to always just kind of keep in mind as you consider whether or not it's appropriate to bestow painkillers is their spiritual good. So making sure that they have a chance to receive last rites and that they're not going into a state of semi-consciousness or unconsciousness because of painkillers, even if it is an appropriate bestowing of painkillers for that reason without having had the opportunity to have their spiritual care.
Right. I mean, we're looking at the total person, right? So even when medicine cannot heal, medicine still must provide care.
Now,
and the same thing on the spiritual. I'm just saying is that we're looking at the whole person.
So along that line, we received questions about how does pain management play into redemptive suffering? If suffering at the end of life is a means of preparing your soul for meeting God, is it doing a disservice to someone to give them drugs that will help reduce the pain? Or is it appropriate to encourage them to maybe forgo that for the sake of having some suffering to prepare their soul to meet God?
Right.
How would you kind of look at that from the more holistic approach?
So again, let's kind of step out of the death stage.
Okay.
Let's just look at in general. You know, we are all called to unite ourselves to Christ, right? So little inconveniences, little difficulties, little struggles, right? We all make offerings. We're called to make offerings every day. You know, what people say, bite your tongue, you know, but the idea is, you know, the inconvenience that I offer for the good of another human being. Back to what I said earlier about a mom, dad getting up in the middle of the night, you know, to care for their little child in need, you know, knowing they're going to be tired and overwhelmed, but they don't complain. They do it because it's love, is what love demands.
Yeah.
And they offer that for the good of their family, you know, and that's something that should traverse with us throughout our life, whether we be a child all the way toward the end of life, and ever the more toward the end of life, because there is a finality. Right? So we are utilizing these moments of grace to help us prepare to meet our Lord face to face. And for my own well-being as an individual, but also for the good of others. You know, I remember, and I'm not comparing myself in a sense to the people in the stages of dying, but I remember several years ago, you know, when the Lord permitted me to go through a medical dilemma. And I remember, you know, being stuck with more needles and a lot of different things that were very uncomfortable and some of them quite painful, especially arterial sticks, you know, and for blood gases and all these things, and very painful. And, you know, just the inconvenience of, you know, having to take this kind of medication, so to do this test or fast for this or various things. And what I still try to learn, I'm still stubborn like many others in life, is not to waste those moments.
Yeah.
So I would pray for the doctors. I would offer it up for the souls in purgatory. I would offer it up for an end to abortion, in other words, try to be mindful of that. Isn't that what we're talking about even toward the end of life? It's the same. It's utilizing these moments to grow in virtue, to grow in holiness, to grow in a relationship with God that offers to God what I offer. And it's beautiful. It's when we understand it.
That makes sense from the perspective that it's helpful for a patient to have. But from the perspective of a caregiver, it also seems like there is something virtuous about relieving the pain of somebody else and being able to help reduce their suffering.
Right. Isn't there a balance though, Colleen? Because whose suffering am I alleviating? Sometimes people want to give someone more medication to alleviate their discomfort.
So just kind of discerning.
There's a balance again. There's a balance. And so, no, we don't wish intentionally the suffering of any human being. That would be wrong, right? And so, but at the same time, I don't want to, because we know that there is always has been and it remains a spiritual dimension to all of this totality of life, that we cannot ignore that either. And so there's an opportunity for that soul to make amends, things that I may not even know about.
Yeah.
But if I medicate to the point of unconsciousness, I've deprived this individual from an opportunity of reconciliation, of making an amends, apologizing, you know, to meet a family member they haven't met in years and say, I'm so sorry for hurting you. You know, we're missing moments. And at the same time, what I would say, Colleen, there, as you said very beautifully, there are graces for the caregiver. Right? And so there's a moment too for that person, goes back to what we talked about in the first podcast about the Good Samaritan. You know, there's a chance for this person to give of themselves. So not to be afraid of that. And at the same time, no, we don't intentionally just let someone hurt for the sake of hurting. Right? But we also converse with them, you know, Mom, Dad, you want me to give you something? Oh, and if they're conscious, you let them talk to you, right? Let them be a part of the conversation, right? So it's always important. What's the good? What are we trying to address? How do we address it? And is it proportionate to the good?
Yeah.
Very important. You got to keep that always in mind.
Yeah.
And so, but it's very important because I have been in those situations where it's hard, to be in the presence when someone is struggling and there's nothing you physically can do to alleviate it. Yeah. And it's painful because your heart is heavy because you love deeply and you're concerned. And the first movement is you want to alleviate it. Okay, that's a good, right? Yeah. That's a good thing. But you got to pause and say, okay, is there a need? Conversation, or am I trying just to kind of where I don't have to look at it? It's a very different thing.
So it seems like as you're discerning this, you're looking at it is morally appropriate to bestow drugs to help relieve pain as long as it's proportional to the amount of pain that it's like relieving. So you're not giving them a ton of painkillers for something that's more mild. You're kind of discerning as someone's like sickness progresses what is appropriate. Your intention is always to make sure that you are relieving the pain appropriately. And you just kind of discern that as it goes along, and you make sure that you're caring for the rest of their spiritual and physical health as you're going.
I would just say this: you don't give. And I'm again, there are all ways of intervening, but you don't give someone an opiate or morphine when an aspirin will do just fine.
Yeah.
Right. So the idea is really knowing these things
and conversing with a medical professional.
Exactly.
Making sure that the medical professional understands the values, has the patient's good in mind as well, and
each person's tolerance is different.
Yeah.
So, but to answer all the things we've been talking about is basically the directives for Catholic healthcare provide an answer.
Yes.
The Catechism provides an answer. The USCCB's website, our website, the Church's teaching guides us. We're not left alone. We're not left to arbitrariness, and we're not left to intractable pain. The principles guide us. The love of God is with us. The grace that God gives us and through others is present. We're not alone.
And as a final question, is there anywhere that people can turn if they have specific, like if they're encountering a situation where they're not quite sure what to do and they're looking for specific guidance for their specific situation? Our
partnership with the National Catholic Bioethics Center is, and our friendship with the ethicists there is it's ongoing. It's been so wonderful. There's a 24-hour hotline that if you went to the National Catholic Bioethics Center, maybe we can put it in our show notes as well.
I can do that.
NCBC. Yeah. There's a 24-hour hotline. An ethicist is always on call. I myself have directed people because as a bioethicist, sometimes you approach with something that I'm not familiar with, because I'm not dealing with it on a daily basis. And sometimes I'm traveling. Matter of fact, it just happened. I was in the airport going internationally, and I got a phone call, and I'm boarding a plane. Right, I'm in the line. I can't answer your question, but I have it on my phone, and this person was a friend, and I sent the contact, call this number, right? So National Catholic Bioethics Center has a 24-hour hotline. I recommend it highly to anyone that has more in-depth questions, dealing with a extraordinary situation, or just wants clarity in the approach that they're taking.
I'll put that in the description. They have a page where they have both an email that you can send it to and then the phone number, because they say the phone number is for emergency situations. If it's not urgent, you can always email. But you can read what they write about it on the page. And I was going to try to do both the pain management and life support questions in one episode, but I don't want them to be too long. So I think we'll save the life support for the next episode in the series. Good. And we'll just leave this one as pain management.
Absolutely. So I hope it's been helpful. I know it's a little detailed, but I just end with this is we're all called to love, to care, and to bring compassion and to bring empathy into these moments, and to be guided by principles that never change. And they help us. And just as at the beginning of life, we are not abandoned, to the dilemmas and in the sense people are trying to find answers to certain situations. How do we deal with the beginning of life? How do I deal with infertility? How do I deal with an extraordinary circumstance with a child within the womb? How do I deal with an ectopic pregnancy? How do I deal? So at the end of life, or with long-term illnesses,
Mhm.
the church responds
Yeah.
through her pastoral care and through the moral principles that guide us, that always are with us. And so we are not left to the arbitrariness of our world, or left to the secular values, Colleen, of efficiency and utilitarianism that often guides healthcare today, especially with the terminally ill and dying. No,
Amen.
the church is with us. And so to those, like I ended last time, who are caring for our loved ones, caring for friends, caring for their neighbor, thank you for all that you do. To our healthcare, those in the healthcare vocation, thank you for what you do. Thank you for sharing your gifts, your skills for the good of human life. For those in palliative care, thank you for what you're doing. And those that are under that palliative care, helping the dying, through the proper moral means, thank you for what you're doing. It's important. This is the greatest gift we can give to another human being, right? Even when there's nothing we can do to change the outcome of their situation, but we can give them love and we can give care. Awesome. This is what we need to do. So I'm very grateful to all that do this. And I would say in parish ministry, I'll end with this. This is a fundamental service to the gospel. Is so important. It's irreplaceable. And if we really are seeking the good, we need to intervene in people's lives long before they get to these dilemmas. And this is important with our home visitations, our outreach to our sick, and helping people in these moments. So to my brother priest, thank you for what you're doing too. And to the deacons and religious and the lay faithful, all serving God's people. Yeah. What a wonderful way to magnify the greatness of God.
Amen. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Father. And to all of our audience, please like and subscribe. I will put the link to the ebook in the description so you can download that if you're interested. And as always, keep on living the culture of life. God bless.